Happy 4th of July to everyone out there. It's the Album of Record podcast. I'm Craig, joined as always by Andrew. We're recording this a few days early, but it's the 4th of July, Andrew.
Happy birthday, America. Yeah. So I was going to start off today by talking about the fact that obviously it's July, so that means we're halfway into the year, and you start to see a lot of the best albums of the year for the first half start to pop up. And, I don't know, did you listen to IndieCast last week when they did theirs?
Yes.
I find it always a little bit amusing. Like, there were a couple albums that they talked about this year, but most of their list were things that they either didn't talk about at all or barely talked about. And I've seen a couple lists where publications will, have stuff that they really didn't talk about or maybe they didn't review, and all of a sudden it's in the top 10. And I thought it was funny because I was thinking about this because at one point I was like, we should probably just do our list. But then I realized, like, what could we really say? Because our top lists would be all things that we've talked about this year. Like, for me, Deaf Heaven, Scowl, Turnstile, Psychedelic Porn Crumpets, Samia, like, these are all things that we spent a lot of time talking about on the show this year. And I just find that kind of funny. Like, I wonder, is that, like, again, we've talked about this before, like the difference between being a critic versus doing a show like this as fans? Because we don't come at this from a critic's point of view. So, like, we don't have to talk about the new Lorde album, for example, like that. We're not critics. It's not necessarily our wheelhouse exactly, not something that we're going to talk about. Instead, we're just going to talk about the stuff we love every week. And I do wonder if that's like a difference between being a critic versus being a fan.
I think that's a big part of it. The other thing is that you and I do not have to do anything that we don't want to do. And so I felt like those guys, for their various publications that they write for on a regular basis, were tasked to summarize the first half of the year. And we do it if we feel like it. But, they basically do all their own show prep in their professional lives. And then they talk about the things that they probably wrote about in the last week. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for them too. But there's another angle to it as well. It's like, by the time we get to our year-end show, are we going to talk about all those same records now for a third time potentially? We talked about them when they came up. We talked about them at the mid-year review, and now we're going to talk about them at the year-end review. Like, I feel like I say the most important things I have to say about the record the first time we talk about it, and very rarely do I have something new that's facts have been recast or something new occurs to me about a record. Either I loved it or I didn't. Maybe I fell out of love with it. Maybe I fell more in love with it, but I just don't want to do it 3 times.
Yeah. With the exception of Dark Matter, we definitely did our fair number of episodes where we talked about that album. And I did feel like it was appropriate every time we did, just for who we are as music fans, as Pearl Jam fans. It was something that we wanted to touch on and like talk about it in different contexts throughout the year. And that this maybe perhaps will tie a little bit into what we're going to talk about later in this episode. But like, was Dark Matter like prisoner of the moment situation, or was it legitimately that good of an album that, it's going to withstand that test of time, that we're still going to feel it's as vital a year from now or a year after its release as we did the year it came out?
Well, and I think that was also kind of an ongoing story as the tour unfolded, and you and I both saw them live, and I saw the year-end tour for 2024, and then I saw the year-end tour stop for 2025, and so it just felt organic to me. But did we over-index on Dark Matter compared to some of the other records that we've talked about over the years? Yeah, definitely. But,
for sure,
we are Pearl Jam. So
yeah, I mean, exactly. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. As I was I was just listening to that episode, and some of it could be like maybe some of Steven's picks, because he listens to pretty different music from what I'm into. So like some of that stuff maybe that he did talk about, and it just never sank in with me, and I kind of forgot that he's talked about it. But it just felt like as they were doing their list, I'm like, man, you guys, I really didn't feel like they had really talked about many of those albums. With the exception of Ian did talk about Greet Death, which too, in his defense, he couldn't have talked about it prior to that one.
Yeah.
So, segue.
Yeah, which is where we're going to begin today. One of our favorite bands from the last 5, 6 years. I guess that they came on our radar in 2019 when New Hell was released. Greet Death released their new record, Die in Love. And yeah, you and I have been, I don't know how much you've listened to it. I've listened to it a ton since last Friday. It is a wonderful record. There are no skips. It's a perfect length. The songs have room to breathe. The minute it ends, I want to start it over again. And we can talk about where it fits in and what it might do for them as a band. But I guess that's where I'll start and drop it off to you.
Yeah. New Hell in 2019 was a big deal for both of us. Famously, I think we've talked about this before. You and I were supposed to see them open for Deaf Heaven here in Columbus in 2020, early 2020. And it was right when everything got locked down that they canceled that tour. And what's funny is, in that time, Deaf Heaven, obviously had Infinite Granite and then came back with Lonely People in Power, which an album we both love. But I would say Greet Death has been fairly quiet as a band in that time since 2019. They put out an EP, which was fine. I don't know how much I didn't like go crazy with that EP, but other than that, like, it's been pretty quiet. Like, this is their first album since 2019. Like, that's 6 years is a long time for a young band to go in between releases. And so I would say
before you continue, I think this is one of the differences between how you listen to music and how I listen to music. I play a record a lot of times and then I let Spotify autoplay off the end of that record. And so I ended up hearing a lot of those Greet Death EP songs mixed in after I finished other records. And so I feel like it was almost like a couple of singles really hit me over the head. And I couldn't tell you the names because I'm really bad with song names, but I definitely ended up listening to that a fair amount just because it was in my algorithm and in my space.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I would say, I don't know how you felt going into this, but I would say my anticipation was originally somewhat measured. I don't know if I would say muted, but measured. I just wasn't sure what to expect from a new Greet Death album after so long. I just wasn't sure what kind of space they were in. How, sometimes you just don't know. When bands take this long, maybe sometimes it can be for a lot of different reasons, but sometimes it's just that creative spark hasn't been there. And so I just didn't know. But I think the second I heard their first single, I immediately pre-ordered the album on vinyl. I was just like, all right, these guys are back. And I was very, very, very excited to check it out, check out this album. So, anticipation is one thing, but the realization of that anticipation is sometimes another. And I would say for me, this album exceeded my expectations of what I was really hoping for. I think the song Country Girl is maybe my favorite song of the year by any band. I really, really love that song a lot. I don't know, like, they're not doing anything novel.
I think somebody set off the fire alarm in the house here. I'm going to mute myself. Keep going.
All right. I thought maybe you were calling a foul on my take there or something. But yeah, I would say, like, this is not like a groundbreaking album. This is just a absolute masterclass in songwriting. And I really, really enjoy the different textures and elements that the two sides of this band can bring out of themselves. I don't know if that's a factor of the different songwriters in the band or what, but there are some things that sort of lean almost in an alt country kind of world a little bit, but then there's elements that are like just this heavy, like, drone, like, sort of we talked about last week, like what is like heavy shoegaze. Like,
well, hang on a second. Can you tell the difference between which is a Logan song and which is a Harper song?
Well, I don't know which is which. So I can't say, like, I know that this is a Logan song, this is a Harper song. but I definitely feel like you can tell the two different sides in their songwriting. I just don't know which is which.
Yeah. So Logan he wrote the first two songs, I'm almost positive. Country Girl was almost definitely written by Harper. And I think that you can tell based on who's singing, but they
Yeah.
do have, it's a wonderful dynamic. You can tell, or I think you can tell that they both make each other better as
Yeah.
songwriters when they bring the full band in. But I think there's enough variation between what's a Logan song versus what's a Harper song that it's a wonderful dynamic across the record. You get the feeling that they're not scorekeepers, like who had more songs on this record. I
Yeah.
think they just, for the betterment of the group, for the betterment of the record, they just do what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're spot on. And I love bands that do this. Like, I talk a lot about Rancid, for example, a very different band from Greek Death, but
A little bit.
Rancid has those two elements of Tim Armstrong and Lars Frederiksen and their different styles that they bring in their both their songwriting and their singing. And not to mention, once you get Matt Freeman in there as well, he's got an entirely different voice, but he doesn't sing as often. But my point is, I love bands that have multiple songwriters and singers because you really get like, especially when they're like in tune with each other. Sometimes there are bands where like one doesn't maybe necessarily have a lot in common with the other, and then you almost like sit back and it's almost like jarring going between the two different things that they do. But Greek Death does it so seamlessly, even though they're definitely different. They, like, to your point, they complement each other in such a unique and special way. And this, like you said, there's no skips on this from beginning to end. This album is incredible. I was waiting for something to bust my consecutive turnstile listening habit, so I very much appreciate having this to give me something else to listen to in between my turnstile listens. So yeah, this one is definitely going to be up there in my year-end list when we get there, I'm sure.
Yeah, mine too, for sure. I can't imagine it's not going to be well up toward the top of my list. The one thing that has occurred to me as I've been listening to it, though, is if this took the place of New Hell and this was my first exposure to Greet Death, would it have excited me in the same way as some of the songs on New Hell? So I and that's not to downgrade the record or temper anybody's expectations, but I always want to be wary of my own bias as already loving the band and already being in versus how good is this in a more universal standpoint. And I don't know that I'm pretty sure that it doesn't have anything that would have grabbed me the way You're Gonna Hate What You've Done did on New Hell. The things that brought me in just really blew me away. And because I'm already in, I love this to a huge degree. But I wonder if this brings any new people to the table or if this is just the greatest Greet Death record any Greet Death fan could have expected, having already been in the tent.
To me, I view it as like New Hell was an album that was like grabbing you by the shoulders and shaking you, like
Yeah.
as they yelled in your face, like it was screaming for your attention. This album, I feel, is much more nuanced and it's meant to live as a companion to you. They almost like putting an arm around you as they tell you their story. Like, there's been a lot of talk about how they're much more at peace as individuals than they like. New Hell is a crushingly depressing album to the point at
They're
which
dealing
like,
with a lot. I'm not sure exactly what they're dealing with, but they're dealing with a lot on New Hell.
yeah, yeah, and you like to the point that you legit like sort of feel worried about them a little bit. I want to be clear, Die in Love is not a cheery album
No.
whatsoever. I went for a run on Sunday, I think, and I put it on as I was going for my run, and I was like, this is just not running music. Like, it is like, as I'm just sitting there listening, I'm like, this isn't pump you up, go for a run type of music,
No.
this. So I would not say that this is a happy album by any means, but I get what their point is, and that's, I think, to your like kind of what you're getting at. Like, if you didn't have the context of New Hell and this was just the first thing you heard from them, maybe it's not going to grab your attention as much, because I don't think it's designed to do that. And I think when New Hell came out, they probably were more ambitious as a band. Like, I think that they were seeking to, get bigger and become, living musicians. And from some of the interviews I've read, it seems like that's maybe not their goal anymore. You know, they talk a lot about being much more content in their day lives, and that this is just the music is just something that they do, and there's not the urgency to do it. It's very much a we'll do this when we have something to say and when we feel like it's appropriate for our band, but otherwise, like, we're not doing this because we have to or anything like that, which is definitely a different perspective from this album. And those things can carry through, I think, in the degree to which you maybe notice it. But as diehard Greet Death fans, like, we're the target audience for this. Like, this
Yeah.
was made for people like us. So
But to your point about the interviews as well, I think Logan talked about being an Amazon delivery driver and really loving that job because he only has to care about it as much as he has to care about it.
yeah,
Harper disclosed that she is a cook in a Chicago restaurant, I believe. Didn't really opine much about what that job means to her, but
yeah,
it just it didn't sound like anybody was, these crap jobs, they're going to be gone the minute we make it as rock stars. There just was none of that. It was, we love the music for the sake of the music and what it gives to us, and these jobs pay the bills and give us the opportunity to tour from time to time. But nobody has any lottery ticket dreams in this band
right,
anymore. And my instinct is always to be really sad by that at first. But in my firmly middle-aged maturity, I also just come to accept to let people get what they want. And if what they want, they have what they want, then I shouldn't be disappointed for them. Why should I invent that for them? But it just, if you love the art that some artists put out, maybe I shouldn't want to disrupt the lives they lead that bring this art, but it just feels like, man, with art this good, they should be able to do it all the time, and they should be able
yeah.
to make a subsistence living off of it at least.
And this is something we talk about a lot too, is just that this is another band that's like out of place and out of time.
Yeah,
If this band in the 90s would have had a very real chance of being living musicians, like, they would have been popular enough, just as strong as their songwriting is, like, this stuff could play on the radio. Like, some of their stuff, like a song like Country Girl, could absolutely crush on the radio in the 90s. But
and
today it's like,
they'd probably still be a cult band, but that cult would
yeah,
be 10 million people instead of 500,000 or
it's
whatever the scale
it's
is.
Dinosaur Jr. Like that, a band like that, like Dinosaur
Yeah,
Jr. is not like traditionally a huge band, but they certainly had a massive following, were on the radio. And Jay Mascis, to my knowledge, does not have a day job. Like,
yeah.
he did his thing as a musician. So
And on a lower level, you've got the Melvins, who are professional musicians, but they scrape by to a degree
yeah,
that Dinosaur Jr. doesn't. And then it'd be interesting to put all these on a scale, because Dinosaur Jr. had a couple of quote unquote hits that probably pay some of the bills. And then the next level up is like a Ben Folds 5. And Ben Folds had a few more even bigger hits. And then, they're just to stratify all the bands from kind of that 90s. It'd be interesting to slot modern bands today where they would have been if they'd come out when people cared more about guitar rock.
it sounds like a future band project, or I mean a future podcast episode. But
Yeah.
I I think about it in the other way sometimes too. Like, I think like a band like the Toadies coming out today would be just another Greet Death, like a band that, like, in the circles where people really care about this kind of music know them, but like they wouldn't cross that public consciousness the way a band like the Toadies could with a song like Possum Kingdom. Like,
Yeah.
that just doesn't really happen for rock bands today.
No. So the main topic of the day was spawned recently because you were listening to one of the records that you and I associate with the pandemic, because it came out during the pandemic. And why don't you tell everybody a little bit about it? Because you found a little bit of disappointment, maybe, or less quality
Yeah.
than maybe you thought you heard when you listened to it in the moment when it came out.
Yeah. So Craig and I are going to see Deftones this September. And wait, is it September or October? September, right? Yeah, this September. And so I've been like ramping up my Deftones listening a little bit lately. Plus, we did the White Pony anniversary episode a while back. So I've just been, in general, listening to Deftones more than even usual lately. And I've just been like just really remarking to myself how strong these albums still are. These Deftones albums stand up today just like they did back then. Like, it's truly impressive. Like, looking at their catalog today and just what Deftones are as a band that can still play arenas is pretty incredible. But at the same time, though, I was sitting there and I decided to put on Ohms, and that's their 2020 album that came out.
It
An
came out
album
September 25th, 2020.
yeah. And it's an album that you and I both went absolutely crazy for. I think I'm pretty sure we did a podcast episode for that on your previous podcast. And, we've spent a lot of time talking about it, digesting it, and really celebrating it. And so when I went to put this on, I was very excited to listen to it because it had actually been a while. It'd been a couple years since I'd listened to Ohms, actually. So I put it on, and first song, great, all right. And then, like, it fell off a cliff for me really fast, where I found myself, like, just feeling like skipping songs. Like, I didn't, but I wanted to. And, like, about halfway through, I was like, I kind of want to listen to something else. And it was such a jarring experience for me because I never feel that way about Deftones. And it was just like, hit me like just a absolute slap to the face, where it was like, what's going on here? Like, why am I feeling this way about this album? So I talked to you about it, and I think you listened to it and sort of had somewhat of the same feeling that I did. And I think that led us to, I think that led us to this episode idea of how much did we gauge albums in 2020 in the pandemic on a curve based on the situation we were in at that time.
So, well, first things first, double check which microphone your system is using while you get a chance. But I did go back and re-listen to Ohms as well. And I don't think it fell off a cliff quite the way for me that it did for you, but I definitely felt lesser about it than I did in the moment when the world still felt kind of shut down and people weren't doing normal things. I remember going on way too many runs. I really wore out my legs that year listening to Ohms and just being addicted to the way that track list flowed, and the way the record finishes is just incredible. But I think you're right. I think maybe I overrated the lowest spots of that record for sure. But then obviously that makes me wonder, because you and I do this podcast and we overthink everything with regard to music, what other records? And we can probably skip Gigaton by Pearl Jam because we've already talked about how much worse we feel about that record today than we did, especially after Dark Matter came out. But I wanted to kind of talk about some of the other records that felt like just oases in the desert when they were released in 2020 when we needed them most, and whether or not they hold up. Some of them do, some of them maybe we would like to rethink. So do you want to go back and forth? How do you want to do this?
Yeah, we can go back and forth talking about a couple different ones. Sure. I think for me, a big one that jumps out that I don't think you ever were into as much as I was is Porridge Radio, their album Every Bad.
I remember listening to it, but yeah.
That was my number 9 album of the year, which is crazy high. And it's an album that I do not listen to at all anymore. So, like, I have such strong memories of this because this was one of the first albums that I really was listening to with a different perspective while locked in my house. I remember just sitting right here where I'm sitting, working for the first time, working remotely and trying to understand, like, am I going to have a job? Like, is this going to work? Like, what's going to happen? I just really so strongly tie that album to the initial pandemic.
So another one that I would say I probably overrated, and then I'm going to talk about some that still hold up, by the way. This isn't just about trashing work that served its purpose in the moment. This is kind of a double whammy. We got the surprise album by the band Hum called Inlet. It came out in June of 2020. And I don't think I was over the moon for this record even in the moment, but it sounded like Hum, and I really enjoyed it a lot. I don't think it finished high on my list that year, but I definitely haven't really gone back to it either. So I think that's kind of a telltale sign that maybe it wasn't to me quite what it could have been.
Yeah, I think I felt the same way. That's another album. Like it's, I told you before we started recording, like just looking at my list from that year, it's staggering to me how little of these albums I listen to today. It's like all these albums that were incredibly important in 2020 because they had that greater context have become so disposable to me today. Like they're almost just like locked away because of what that time was and sort of how that felt. But yeah, that that Hum record is definitely one that fits in there. Another big one for me that actually I think kind of holds up is excuse me, Run the Jewels.
RTJ,
RTJ4. Yeah. I mean,
June 3rd, 2020.
for a lot of reasons, obviously. Like that doesn't just have pandemic context, it also has Black Lives Matter context to it as well. And, you know, so it's kind of got like that dual meaning. And it's almost one of those things that I can listen to that today. And I've listened to it once or twice, probably every year since then. I still really like it, but it still just feels so heavily tied to that time.
Yeah, that one I had never, that was my first exposure to Run the Jewels, and that one definitely holds up for me. And then I saw them, I'm 99% sure I saw them open up for Rage Against the Machine when that show was finally rescheduled in a sort of post-pandemic world, and just phenomenal. Just phenomenal. So I think that one holds up. Another one that definitely holds up for me is a it's a band that I didn't listen to a ton before this record, but this record cemented them for me as a band. It's a band called Dikembe. They're kind of an emo rock band out of Florida, and they had a record called Muck that came out, and it
That's a
is
good one.
still just one of my absolute favorite records from the last 10 years. It absolutely holds up. I was able to see them live at a certain point when things finally opened up and shows were happening again. And it was when shows were happening again, but every other tour felt like it was getting delayed or canceled for 2 or 3 weeks. But that record is one that definitely holds up for me. It was in the top. It was high on my list back in 2020.
Yeah, I loved that album as well, and that was actually on my list of things to talk about today. So definitely a good pick, and I agree with all that. Another one sort of similar to that for me in terms of like a band or an album that came out of nowhere was Record Setter. I Owe You Nothing,
Oh,
and that is one that if I listen to it today, I still really like it, but I have a hard time listening to it because of how much I associate it with that time period. I think it's a very aggressive screamo, but with also emo, just regular emo elements mixed in.
there's a huge sadness to that.
Yes, yeah. And they actually put out album this year, and even listening to that again, I really like it, but it's like again, it's not their fault and I feel bad about it, but like it feels so connected to that one specific time period. And I just have such a hard time with like so many of these things taking me back to that time period.
Yeah, which that's a good lead in for my next one. Francis Quinlan had a record called Likewise. It actually came out January 31st, 2020, so kind of just before everything went to hell. And Francis Quinlan is the singer from Hopalong, and am a huge Hopalong fan. I don't know if that band still exists or not. So I am or was, depending on their current state. But that's a record that I associate with all my walks through the park with my dog all by myself. And I love the record, but I don't really feel like listening to it anymore. And it's no fault of the art. It's no fault of the artist. It's still amazing. I listened to it again recently just to verify that I still love it. And I do. It's insanely good. But to your point, the associations and bringing me back there, I don't want to go back. And so
Yeah.
that record might get lost to time for me.
There's a band that in my head is like intrinsically tied to Hopalong. I don't know if you know which band I'm talking about and if you have them on your list to talk about, which I assume you maybe do. So I'm going to just skip it for now. I'll come back to it if you don't talk about it.
All right.
But an interesting one for me from this time period, and I believe it came out later in the year. I feel like I remember listening to this more in the fall, but that's Sparta, their album Trust the River. And it was just kind of funny because, so for people who don't know, Sparta is Jim Ward from At the Drive-In, his offshoot from that band when that band splintered into Mars Volta and Sparta. And, I personally liked Sparta more than Mars Volta early in their careers, like their first couple albums. But Mars Volta has been such a creative tour de force over the years that it's hard to just deny their output and everything. Sparta really slowed down after those first 2 or 3 albums and kind of seemed like maybe they were done at a certain point. And then At the Drive-In announced that they were reuniting, but Jim Ward wasn't going to be a part of it, which was kind of a weird thing. And so in all of that context, Sparta came out with another album, and there were 2 or 3 songs that I adored on Trust the River and really, really loved those songs. But, I don't really, I don't think Sparta have done anything since then. So it's kind of a weird thing where this is they're the last thing in my head that Sparta did is basically a pandemic record with a lot of extra context around it.
Yeah, Sparta never really did much for me, even when they were like the big active band. So I never dove into that one very much. I have 2 more. One was one of my very favorite bands in the world before the pandemic release, and the other one is a band that became one of my favorite bands based on this one record, which I think is basically perfect. I know for a fact it was my number 1 record in 2020, but I'm going to do that one last. I'm going to go to Mansions, who did Big Bad.
That's the one I was talking about. I don't know why. Did they tour with Hop Along by any chance?
It would make sense, but I really don't remember.
I don't know why I connect those 2 bands. I always think of, whenever you talk about Hop Along, I immediately think of Mansions, and I don't
maybe
know.
That's why I love them both.
It's just because you always would talk about them in 2020.
Yeah. So Mansions released Big Bad, which was probably their most understated record of their career. It felt almost like, so Mansions is Christopher Browder and I think it's his wife who plays bass, and he is the principal songwriter. And so to some degree, every Mansions record has been kind of a solo record. He started out as a guy with a guitar all by himself, and then the band kind of formed around him and everything else. But Mansions Big Bad from 2020 ended up sounding like the manifestation of kind of going back to the solo roots almost. It sounded like his artistic vision on everything. There was a lot of programmed percussion and keyboards and synthesizers for atmospheric purposes that had never been in the music before. I recently went back and started listening to this one again, and it still holds up for me. And thankfully, it doesn't have the same cloud hanging over it for me the way that Francis Quinlan's does. But what a great record. But again, almost like Greet Death, it's one of those records that it only really probably works in the context of if you're already a fan of Mansions.
So I don't think that's true, actually. I'm going to actually counter that, because I was not familiar with Mansions before this album. This was my introduction to them.
Wow.
And it was my number 6 album of the year. I really loved that album, and I had no other context for it. So I'll maybe push back on that a little bit. I think that one is just a very, I don't know, for me, it was just very artistic in all the right ways, if that makes sense. It just, it did enough things that were interesting to make it stand out in that year. So I have the same number 1 album of 2020 as you did, the one album we're going to talk about here in a second. So I'm going to hold off on talking about that one. But before I sort of wrap up my segment, I'm just sitting here looking at my list, and I'm just going to rapid fire just mention some of these albums that it's funny that I just do not listen to. And some of these are bands that I don't listen to anymore.
Ones that you've just black holed.
Yeah.
Memory hold.
My number My number 4 album of the year was Envy, The Fallen Crimson. And I actually do listen to Envy still, but not Fallen Crimson. No way have I listened to that album since 2020.
I haven't listened to that record in a long time either, but I love it. It's great.
It's so good. Let's see here. Number 10 was Thurston Moore, solo album By the Fire, which I never listened to. Number 11 was Svalbard,
I remember
which is
that one.
hilarious, though, because that's a band that I don't listen to anymore. Number 12, Adult Life. It's like adult with a K in between the L and T. Like it looks like a typo.
As you do.
Yeah, yeah. I have an Andrew Cedarmark album on here, which I loved, but don't listen to that anymore. Fontaine's DC, A Hero's Death was number 16. So it's just kind of funny to like look at some of these bands that are on here and just really realizing what a weird year 2020 was musically. But the last one I'm going to talk about is one I know you loved as well. I'm curious if you listen to this one at all anymore. This is one that 1000% holds up. This album is freaking incredible. The band is Nothing, and it's The Great Dismal, which is such a depressing listen. Like, Nothing is a interesting band. You have to be in the right mood to listen to Nothing, I think, anyways. But like having the ties to 2020 and being a pandemic record and all that just gives this one so much more weight that I just have a hard time reaching for this album if I'm going to listen to Nothing. I'm much more likely to listen to pretty much any of their other albums.
It's definitely my favorite Nothing record. I still do listen to this one from time to time. And the album opener, A Fabricated Life, is maybe the strongest opening of any record that year. Just killer. And that's the artistry of putting a record together the way is it just it's essentially a one man
Essentially,
band.
yes. I think they might be a little bit of a band now. I think they have at least one other member that's pretty full time now, I think.
The Great Dismal could not have been a more perfect record for the pandemic and what we were going through. But to your point, it holds up. This is a band that, like, if they released a single this week and said we have something coming in 60 days, I would give it the chance to reshape the entire second half of the year for me. This band absolutely is that good.
Yep,
where would you put them, like, in comparing them to other bands? I always have a tough time contextualizing this band in the landscape of hard independent music.
Yeah. So like obviously they're not like a super popular band, but for me personally, like this is a band that anytime they put anything out, I'm going to stand up and notice and pay attention and be super excited about. I do have periods where I kind of forget about them between releases. Doesn't last forever. Like, I mean, I go through phases where it's like, oh yeah, Nothing. And then I'll like listen to all of their albums and like dive in, and then maybe a period goes without them. But it's definitely one of the bands that I personally respect just about as much as anybody. Like in terms of my expectations of what they're going to deliver, I think it's when they talk about bands that don't miss, Nothing is a band that they don't miss.
So they're nothing like Holy Fawn, but I think of them kind of contextually the same way.
That's a great one.
One is far more aggressive than, Holy Fawn is far more aggressive than Nothing. There's like an industrial element to them both a little bit in a weird way, where I just think they're kind of genre mates, even though they're not exactly alike.
Yeah. No, that's a super great comparison for sure. Yeah, I don't even have much to add to that. That's just so spot on. I can't even think of anything I could even really compare to. And
just as an aside, Holy Fawn has a new record coming out this year, right?
Yes, they do.
All right, so Holy Fawn's going to get an episode, whether you like it or not.
Absolutely.
We've just decided.
1000%.
All right, we buried the lead long enough. The record, the band that I discovered during the pandemic, I can't remember whether you heard it first and told me to listen to it or vice versa.
You brought it to me.
Okay. Brave Faces Everyone by Spanish Love Songs, they couldn't have written a more prescient record for the moment. It is one of the most depressing, caustic records that I've ever listened to in my entire life. I still play it probably 10 to 12 times a year minimum. 5 years later, it's the singles live on in my algorithm. Their follow-up record was really solid, but nothing. They're going to have a tough time topping Brave Faces Everyone. It's probably a perfect emo record as far as the genre goes.
It's almost to their detriment how good this album is. Like,
Yes.
because everything they do can only be compared to this. And I sometimes view this a little bit like, I call this like the Titus Andronicus effect, where Titus Andronicus puts out the Monitor and it's like, well, shit, like, how can they ever put out something that's going to resonate with people like that album did? And so, like, that's sort of the task that Spanish Love Songs have given themselves. I think they just have one album since then, right? Yeah, the one that came out a couple years ago. And like, and it was hard to listen to that album and not be like, man, I just kind of want to go back and listen to Brave Faces, right? Like, I don't know, like, it's not fair. It's hard to really specify why this happens to certain bands, and like other
Let me
bands
interrupt
like,
you for a second because I felt the same way about Manchester Orchestra for a while too. It took them 2 or 3 records for me to be like, oh, they figured it out again. And now
yeah,
we're charting new territory. But I think it's jarring for any band to put out anything so iconic as what Brave Faces Everyone was. And again, we're talking
mm-hmm.
about a niche here. You go man on the street like David Letterman, 999 out of 1,000 people are never going to have even heard of Spanish Love Songs. But in that corner of the world, man, that was a big record and it's just perfect.
Yeah, like even in 2020, like this wasn't a big album universally, but in the blogosphere, the indie blogosphere, like this album was just massive, and it was just such a powerful statement. I don't know how much of this was written pre-pandemic. Like you have to be careful with a lot of these albums that came out in 2020, because it's you want to say a lot of them were a reflection of the time, but a lot of them were written largely before the pandemic. But when you listen to this album, like, it's just impossible not to think about what you were doing in 2020 when you first heard these songs, and to think about what life was like at that time as you listen to these songs. And this album was just the absolute perfect companion for that time. And we didn't talk about it today, but we've talked about it in the past. Like, that's the curve that Gigaton got for Pearl Jam. Like, today I don't listen to Gigaton and be like, man, that was a great album, but it was my number 2 album on my list from 2020, just because of how important it was to me in that time of what we were going through and what life was like. This, like I've often said, Gigaton was like a very important friend being there for you. And in every way, that's what Spanish Love Songs was with this album too. Like, it was just something that was always there for us in the pandemic.
All right. Last but not least, I want to contrast 2 records that neither one of us, it's not important to either one of us. I think you probably listened to both. I know I listened to both, where I think the culture properly rated one and completely overrated the other.
Okay.
All right. So
I know one of the two you're going to talk about. I'm not sure
I,
the other one.
yeah. So the first record that I think was rated super high, and I've grown to love it more, I just didn't listen to it in the moment, is Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher. I think that one was an absolute blockbuster. I think it deserves to be a blockbuster, whether you like that genre or Phoebe Bridgers or not. It's a near perfect record, if not a perfect record.
That album is a monster, like just an absolute monster. And it was at the time. Yeah, absolutely. That one is properly rated. That is an iconic indie album.
And the other one, I always tell the joke, like, has everybody stopped pretending that Fetch the Bolt Cutters was good? Fiona Apple's
We
record is unlistenable. It's unlistenable. All you people love her so much individually and personally that you're going to pretend the art's good, and it's not.
This got a perfect 10 from Pitchfork, if you
You know what I have to
recall.
say about that?
Yeah, man. Like, I think you and I we're always on the same page with that one. Very much not an album for me. And I say this as somebody who has listened to a fair amount of Fiona Apple in my life. Like
Me too.
I like Fiona Apple, but for me, that album was definitely not what I needed or wanted in that time.
No, and I always, a little bit more seriously, I compare it to one of those Best Picture nominees that achieves something in artistic vision that is in the running for Best Picture, but nobody ever watches it more than once.
Like Mulholland Drive.
Yeah. No, that's a good one. There are a lot of them. The piano.
Yeah.
I wonder how many people still listen to Fetch the Bolt Cutters.
I don't know. I don't know. Like, does Spotify break it down like monthly listens by album, or is it just by artist?
Just by artist. It does, I guess one song is in her popular tracks from that one, but that doesn't really say much. Her previous records were so big and so iconic. But the most popular song on that record is 52 million streams.
Yeah.
And she's got 2.8 million monthly listeners.
You know what? You know what everybody was listening to in 2020? An artist who put out 2 albums in 2020. And he get
Taylor Swift.
Folklore and Evermore. Yep.
I mean,
it's funny to think about those because those don't feel like pandemic records to me.
Oh, they do to me, especially because I mean, I live in a household with a wife who loves Taylor Swift, so I watched the Apple TV Plus special about them.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I think those albums are properly rated and hold up. I think the Fetch the Bolt Cutters for Taylor Swift is probably the Tortured Poets department where that double record came out and everybody pretended like it was this great thing, and it can't crack any of her popular song lists anywhere.
I found that album a struggle to get through. I really did. I'm not a Swiftie by any means, but
sure.
I listen to everything she puts out because I live in this society. It's a part of the culture. Folklore especially. I think Folklore is a really, really good album.
They're my 2 favorite Taylor Swift indie rock records.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And they're great.
Yeah. I've not gone back to Evermore much, but Folklore, very, very good album.
Whenever you activate the Justin Vernon Bon Iver cheat code, you're going to have hits on your hand. And I know you don't like Bon Iver, but you got to admit that dude's a cheat code.
Absolutely. And like, I think a big part of what I don't like about Bon Iver is like a lot of it is just his voice. Probably hearing Taylor Swift sing him probably doesn't bother me as much. But yeah, I mean,
he used his real singing voice more in that and less of the falsetto.
Yeah, yeah. And what's the guy from The National did a lot on that album too? Aaron.
I always forget his name. Aaron Dresner.
Yeah. So,
it was Aaron Dresner and then the guy from Bleachers and Fun.
Jack Antonoff.
Jack Antonoff. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
If you and I couldn't come up with Jack Antonoff's name in this podcast, we should have had to give up the podcast.
For sure. Yeah, so she knew what she was doing with who she was working with on those albums too. And I always say, like, that's not to turn this into a Taylor Swift episode, but I always think that's part of her genius. Like,
oh yeah,
she understands like the assignment, whatever it is she's going for. She always seems to like reach for the right producers and the right people to work on the albums, and that's why she's able to have all these albums that span all these different genres and do all these very different things. And she's just unbelievably successful with all of them. So, love her or hate her, you can't deny like what a just absolute powerhouse she is in her ability to just understand music, like in general.
Yeah. Well, and a little close to home, she and Taylor and Travis had a late lunch in Chagrin Falls today. It's all
they did
back at home.
I didn't see that.
Yeah, I'm not there, but now I feel like we're close personal friends because they dined in my hometown.
Yeah, there you go. That's what you're missing out on.
Yeah. Well, we hope you guys keep all your digits this 4th of July. Leave the fireworks to the professionals. Don't end up a cautionary tale.
For sure.
All right.
Good
Thanks so much
advice.
for listening. You can find us at albumofrecord.com, all the podcast apps. YouTube is a great place to watch the show and have a good time. We appreciate you. We'll talk to you next time. It's been the Album of Record podcast.